It's your favorite history teacher, Mr. Thomas, here today to talk about the rise and fall of Napoleon. Now, he was born on a small Mediterranean island called Corsica. He rose to become the leader of France, and at one point in time, he controlled most of the continent of Europe. This kind of meteoric rise can only happen in the aftermath of the great changes that came as a part of the French Revolution. Let's get started. Many changes came about because of the French Revolution. The old estate system was thrown out, titles of nobility were eliminated, the king himself was guillotined, and the Catholic Church was brought under state control. Through all these changes, new opportunities arose for ambitious people. In the wake of these great changes, Napoleon found opportunities to rise up and take control of France. Now, where did this man come from? Napoleon Bonaparte was born in Corsica in 1769. Now, Corsica had only recently become a French territory. Prior to that, it was Italian land. But since it was French, Napoleon was able to attend military schools and join the French army. On his graduation at 16 years old, Napoleon was commissioned a lieutenant in the French military. By the time he was 24, he was a general. In 1795, Napoleon first gained national attention by defeating a royalist rebellion that was trying to attack the National Convention. Because of this, he was ultimately appointed to commander of the armies at a mere 26 years old by the Directory. Now, the Directory was going to send him over to Italy in order to motivate a French army that had been stagnating there for some time. Before he moved on to the Italian campaign, he does marry Josephine, who is going to be the love of his life. She was about 6 years older than Napoleon. She had been married before, and she was currently a mistress of a general, but Napoleon loved her, and he married her. Now, soon after his marriage, he is sent to Italy, and Napoleon was able to take an unmotivated, disheartened group of French soldiers, give them a sense of pride, and lead them to a series of stunning victories on the Italian peninsula. At the Battle of Rivoli, he was outnumbered, but he managed to capture half the forces that he faced. He took control of the entire peninsula in just a year. It was seen as something amazing that couldn't be done, and the Directory became even more worried about Napoleon because a man this popular was a threat to their power. What did the Directory do? They sent him to Egypt. Because he was too popular, the Directory figured if they can send him out of the country, all the better it was for them. Their goal was to prevent British trade with India and disrupt that trade coming across the Mediterranean. But Napoleon felt the weight of history on his shoulders. So he brought with him scholars and scientists and historians. He wanted to study Egyptian history. And it was a good thing that he did. Some of his soldiers were able to find a rather unique stone that you see down there on the lower right-hand side. It's called the Rosetta Stone, and it has 3 different languages inscribed on it. At the top, you have Egyptian hieroglyphics. In the middle, you have Demotic. And at the bottom, you have Greek. Now, people knew how to read Greek and write Greek. People knew how to read and write Demotic, although there were only a few scholars that could do that. But the last person that could understand hieroglyphics had died centuries before this. This stone was taken back to France and studied for a couple of decades, and a French scholar was able to decipher the Egyptian hieroglyphics on here. And from that beginning, he used it as a key to decipher other hieroglyphics as well. An ancient language was rediscovered because of this stone. Obviously, in order for Napoleon to get from France to Egypt, he needed ships. Napoleon's troops disembarked from the ships, and they marched towards the pyramids, at which they faced a large army of Mameluke Turks. Napoleon easily defeated this army. However, that's not really the whole story of this campaign, because Napoleon's navy was left back at the mouth of the Nile, and there a British admiral named Horatio Nelson defeated Napoleon's navy. Without those ships to bring reinforcements and supplies, Napoleon's Egyptian campaign was doomed to failure. Before news of this kind of a disastrous defeat could reach France, Napoleon left Egypt and went back to France. Upon his return, Napoleon took power from the Directory in November of 1799 with a quick coup d'etat, or seizure of power. As the Directory was overthrown, A new constitution was created that named Napoleon First Consul. After this constitution was created, he held a plebiscite vote to approve his actions. Napoleon took the title First Consul for life just 2 years later, and 2 years after that, Napoleon assumed the title of Emperor of France, which again was approved by a plebiscite vote. Napoleon invited the Pope to come anoint him emperor, but he broke with tradition. Typically, popes had crowned French kings. Napoleon took the crown from the Pope's hand and put it onto his own head as a symbolic gesture to show that he was above the Pope. Napoleon later crowned his own wife, Josephine, as his empress. This happened in December of 1804. Here's a picture of Napoleon with the crown that he is about to place onto Josephine's head. You can see her kneeling before him. On the left, you have Napoleon, a portrait done of him after he assumed the emperorship of France. On the right, you have Louis XVI as an absolutist king. There's a lot of similarities between these pictures. The robes, the symbol of power, the regal nature of them all. People that looked at Napoleon's portrait began to think about Louis XVI and wonder, had the French Revolution been for nothing? The French Revolution eliminated a king with absolute power, and yet now there's an emperor that has seemingly unlimited power? This thought was going to trouble many a Frenchman for years to come. Under Napoleon, France underwent a series of changes. Now, perhaps Napoleon's greatest achievement did not come on the battlefield. Those victories were all undone by the time he was exiled the second time. One thing that has stood the test of time since then is the Napoleonic Code, or sometimes referred to as the Code Napoleon. It became the foundation of the French legal system and was exported to many of their colonies as well. It was a uniform system of laws, and it created a sense of unity amongst the French people. It called for equality of all citizens, well, at least all male citizens, and advancement in French society was to be based on merit. In other words, your skills, not your birth rate, not your background. Women did have fewer rights than men. Slavery was restored in the French colony, and overall, the Napoleonic Code wasn't based on Enlightenment thought. It was really promoting law and order over individual rights. So in order to maintain order, they could limit your freedom of speech or even the freedom of press. This system of laws becomes the foundation for many other nations' system of laws as well. Economically, Napoleon changed many things as well. He set up a French national bank, and he reorganized the tax collection system to make it more efficient. He also addressed corruption and ineffectiveness in the French government. This greatly increased the French economy, and more money started coming into the French treasury. Napoleon made many social changes as well. For instance, he established lycees, or government-run public schools, that were used to train future government officials. He also signed a concordat with the Pope in order to restore Catholicism to France. However, he made sure that France was not going to give up the lands that they had confiscated from the Catholic Church during the Revolution. Napoleon had dreams of a worldwide empire, but those dreams were dashed after a successful slave revolt in Haiti. The French were unable to retake that particular colony, and therefore they were unable to protect the rest of their New World assets. When the United States came to France and asked to buy the city of New Orleans for $10 million in 1803, Napoleon was quick to make a counteroffer, $15 million for New Orleans and the rest of the Louisiana Territory. Of course, the United States said yes and doubled the size of their nation, and Napoleon lined his pockets with $15 million that he could use to fund his wars in Europe. Less than a year after crowning himself Emperor of all France, Napoleon was focused on invading Great Britain, and he assembled a French and Spanish fleet to bring his troops to England. England, of course, used its navy to defend itself, and at the Battle of Trafalgar, off the southwest coast of Spain, Lord Admiral Horatio Nelson, same one that attacked Napoleon's navy at the Battle of the Nile, was able to defeat this combined French and Spanish force. Because of this disastrous defeat, Napoleon abandoned his plans for invading Great Britain. He began to focus his attention onto the continent, but he never gave up the idea of conquering Great Britain, and that's going to lead to one of his mistakes that we'll find out about later. A lovely quote from Lord Nelson. Now that Napoleon was focused on the continent, he had to deal with the combined forces of Britain, Russia, Austria, and Sweden that were leveled against him. Napoleon was able to send crushing defeats against his enemies in a series of brilliant battles. The greatest of these battles was Austerlitz, where Napoleon was able to defeat a coalition leveled against him in December of 1805, just 1 year after declaring himself emperor. This led to the collapse of the Holy Roman Empire, of a nation that had been in existence since the days of Charlemagne. It led to the creation of the Confederation of the Rhine. Now, Napoleon was in charge of most of Europe at this time. In order to control his empire, he ruled some parts of it directly, he had allies for other parts of it, and he used puppet governments. Now, a puppet government is run by a puppet ruler, and that's just a person who is supposedly independent, but in actuality is controlled by some outsider. Napoleon would often use members of his own family as puppet leaders in other nations. By 1810, Napoleon divorced the love of his life, Josephine, because she was getting too old to bear a son, and Napoleon wanted an heir so he could pass on everything that he had gathered. He married Maria Louise of Austria, and he had a son, Napoleon II. This map in 1807 shows the territory that France had either conquered or controlled directly or indirectly at that time. Napoleon was a mastermind at using nationalism to unify his country and to inspire his troops, but nationalism can be a two-edged sword. Other nations could use it for the same exact purposes, and as Napoleon conquered other territories, he found nationalism was rising in those countries. Napoleon's first major mistake was enacting the continental system. Now, the continental system was a plan that Napoleon had to weaken Great Britain economically so that he could conquer their country after their economy was destroyed. And this started by Great Britain actually blockading French ports so that ships couldn't bring their goods into French-controlled ports. Now, the British Navy was strong and was able to have an effective blockade. France responded with an embargo against all British goods in November 1806. Napoleon wanted to make sure that no British ship could land at a French port or a French allied port on the entire continent of Europe. Since Great Britain was an island nation, Napoleon believed that they depended on trade in order to get the resources that they need. However, smugglers and uncooperative allies and puppet governments that wanted British goods were weak and ineffective and allowed for British goods to leak on into the continent. This continental system ended up hurting Napoleon more so than it hurt Great Britain, and violations of the continental system led to two other major mistakes. Here's a map of the continental system, and notice that Portugal is not included in this. That's going to become a gateway for a lot of British activity. And it led to the Peninsular War. The peninsula in question is the Iberian Peninsula, which is made up of the countries of Spain and Portugal. Napoleon sent troops across Spain to attack Portugal, trying to enforce his continental system. The Spanish protested, so Napoleon defeated the Spanish army, removed the king, and placed his own brother onto the throne of Spain. This sparked a rise in Spanish nationalism, and with the support of the Catholic Church, the Spanish rose up and fought against the French. The Spanish army was in no shape to go toe-to-toe with the French army, because the French army was better trained and equipped and had more veteran troops. Instead, the Spanish fought as guerrillas, and they used small hit-and-run tactics and ambushes in order to the strength and the morale of the French troops there. Great Britain, sensing an opportunity to attack its enemy France, supported these Spanish guerrillas with supplies, weapons, troops, and some training as well. Even the Duke of Wellington went there to help out the Spanish rebels. Over the course of the Peninsular War, Napoleon lost some 300,000 soldiers. This painting, called the 3rd of May, 1808 by Goya, shows a line of French soldiers shooting at Spanish civilians. Perhaps Napoleon's greatest mistake was the Russian invasion of 1812. In 1812, Russia was ostensibly allied with Napoleon, but Tsar Alexander I was violating Napoleon's continental system. By June of 1812, Napoleon raised an army of almost 500,000 and sent this Grand Armée to Russia. He expected the Russians to defend their borders, and after perhaps one or two battles, Napoleon would be victorious and get the Russians to capitulate. However, the Russians weren't going to play by Napoleon's rules. Instead, what the Russians did was utilize their territory to their advantage. They tactically retreated and burned everything that the French could have used. Their crops, their livestock, anything at all that the French could scrounge to live off the land. By using this scorched earth policy, the Russians prevented the French from getting resupplied in Russian territory, which meant French supply lines had to extend further and further into Russia. And as the Russians retreated more and more, the Russian supply lines got shorter as the French supply lines got longer. As Napoleon's troops were marching deeper and deeper into Russia, they were getting more frustrated from a lack of a decisive battle. It looked as if the Russians were about to give the French what they wanted at the Battle of Borodino. Napoleon does come out victorious at that battle, but it also gave the Russians time to evacuate Moscow and set the city ablaze. A week later, when Napoleon's forces marched into Moscow, they were underwhelmed. There was nothing there. Moscow was abandoned and the city was ablaze. There wasn't anything to loot or live off of. And after 2 weeks, Napoleon was forced to retreat. And it was during that retreat that Russian soldiers would raid the French troops. And these French troops, by now, were starving because of the scorched earth policy of the Russians. They were cold because the winter had set in, and sometimes the temperature dropped to 30 degrees below zero. They were exhausted. Of the almost 500,000 men in the Grand Armée that invaded Russia, a mere 10,000 fighting men returned to France. This was a devastating defeat for Napoleon and France as a whole. As Napoleon left Russian territory, Napoleon was able to raise another army, but it was unable to defeat these new Allied powers. He lost the Battle of Leipzig, and soon thereafter, these Allied nations were able to take the city of Paris, and Napoleon lost support. He abdicated his crown and was exiled to Elba, which is a small island between Corsica and the Italian mainland, Mediterranean. There he was supposed to live out the rest of his life, but we're not done with Napoleon. Since Napoleon had abdicated, France needed a new leader, and that was going to be old Louis XVI's brother, who was crowned Louis XVIII. He became the new king, but he was unpopular. Some French people questioned what was the purpose of the revolution if they were just going to establish another king. Napoleon heard about this unpopularity and was able to escape from his exile in Elba in March of 1815, thus starting his 100 days. He landed in the south of France and was confronted by a military unit sent by the king to stop Napoleon. However, Napoleon convinced that unit and many others to join him and march to Paris. As he marched to Paris, his popularity grew and he became emperor once again. He raised an army and had to defend himself against the forces of Great Britain and Prussia that were leveled against him at Waterloo. At this battle, Napoleon was defeated, and it ends his 100 days. He's exiled for a second time, this time to St. Helena, which is an island in the middle of the South Atlantic, thousands of miles away from France. There he died in 1821. Napoleon does have a grand legacy. By selling the Louisiana Territory to America, he doubled the size of the United States and ushered in an age of American expansion to the West and manifest destiny. By replacing the King of Spain and establishing a puppet government there, he provided an opportunity for Spanish colonies in the New World to rise up and rebel against Spanish rule, and a wave of independence movement breaks out in Latin America. France also turned into a centralized state with a strong constitution. Elections were being held, and citizens had the right to property and access to education, like those lycée schools. Europe was devastated by these years and years of war. The Napoleonic Wars changed borders, removed kings, brought forth great amounts of change across the continent. And large countries and small countries alike met in the city of Vienna in Austria, form what's called the Congress of Vienna, and decide on issues that needed to be addressed in the aftermath of the Napoleonic